Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. As you can see, today's topic is civil rights in the age of conformity. Now, before we begin, as always, hit pause on this video, take time to jot down the lecture outline on the right, and pay particular attention to those key terms at the left. Make sure you can identify the who, what, where, when, why, be able to connect them to each other and their larger historical significance. You got it? Let's get started. All right, guys, this is a lecture I'm extremely excited for because the thing is, as much as I love being able to talk about the histories and talk about the cultures, and something about this lecture always excites me. So let's get this started right away. So that Cold War consensus, it emphasized conformity above all else. But this perceived consensus of conformity that epitomized supposedly American politics and culture in 1950 was not the reality nationwide. Even from its outset, there were always cracks in that consensus culture. There were seeds of discontent in American society that were being planted and watered and fertilized and that began to spring to life by the 1950s. And as we move out of the 50s and into the 1960s, this consensus is going to shatter. And I don't necessarily mean that as a bad thing, because that consensus culture does not reflect the reality of the multi-ethnic, multi-racial background of the United States. And so let me give you a couple of examples of this. Again, there are lots of examples we could go through. And I thought you could spend an entire semester just on the cracks in the consensus. But I want to give you a couple of them. Let's start with music, first and foremost. Because music plays a very large part, as we've seen already when it comes to things like, especially youth culture back in the 20s. And of course, we talked about a little bit last time, and in the 40s with, the Pachucos did not necessarily like the music of their parents. They were old fogies. The same happens in the 1950s. Now, on the screen right now, you see a picture of the Andrews Sisters. Now, the Andrews Sisters were a typical styling of music of the 1940s. It's very patriotic. It's very supportive of the war effort, urging people to come together and do their part. And the funny part is I play this for a number of years now in classes for like basic U.S. history, normal U.S. history survey courses. And I'm always astounded at how many students actually know this song because they still play it in orchestra and bands. But let me give you a little taste of it real quick. He was a famous trumpet man from out Chicago way. He had a boogie style that no one else could play. He was a tough man at his craft. But then his number came up and he was gone with the draft. He's in the army now, a blowing reveille. He's the boogie woogie bugle boy of Company B. They made him blow a bugle for his Uncle Sam. It really brought him down because he couldn't jam. The captain seemed to understand. Because the next day the cat went out and drafted a band. And now the company jumps when he plays reveille. He's the boogie woogie bugle boy of Company B. A toot, a toot, a toot-a-toot-a-toot-a-toot. You get the idea. It's hyper patriotic. It's very supportive of the war effort. And again, I'm not saying anything wrong with that, but that is typical, and it's seen as good, wholesome, patriotic music that, even though it was a product of the World War II in the 40s, you could also understand why parents see this as good, clean, wholesome music that would be supportive of that culture of consensus, a culture of conformity, in the 1950s. But this is not what young people were listening to in the 1950s. No, they were turning to rock and roll, of course. People like, of course, Elvis Presley.
You ain't nothing but a hound dog, crying all the time. You ain't nothing but a hound dog, crying all the time. Well, you ain't nothing but a rabbit and you ain't no friend of mine.
And the thing is, just the lyrics, the music, this is vastly different than this Andrews Sisters. But then when you add to it the person of Elvis, take a look at what he looks like on television.
You get them, you understand? You get the whole thing. Everybody will stand in line and hey, what are Rich Brothers doing here? What are they doing? I was a young man. If you want an autograph, just stand in the back there. I don't care who you are. Everybody wants. I'm Elvis Presley. Elvis Presley. Give me the good old Rudy Valley days. Elvis, sing you this song. I had no idea this performance of Hound Dog was going to cost such a round. The critics jumped all over me for it. I still can't figure out what got him so riled.
That right there. The shaking of his hips. And again, to put it in modern vernacular, he was twerking. I mean, the gyrations of his body, the snarl of his lip. Look at the young lady's face looking at him right now. And I promise you that this is the full, honest truth. The parents were not just scared of losing their kids to this trash music. It was far more pervasive. Yes, they're worried about their daughter's virginity. Always the case with every new, era of music, it seems like. But like we talked about with the jazz age of the 1920s, rock and roll is considered race music. It was a combination of African American stylings alongside, Anglo music. And by incorporating these, infusing them together, we get this hard hitting rock and roll. When you combine that with the looks and the movements of the person on stage, and again, honest truth, parents thought if these young generation, our kids, the youth, can be deceived and manipulated into loving this music so much, could they also be so easily corrupted to embrace communism? And again, they're linking it to that Cold War mentality and worry that this is a crack in that culture of conformity that, if left unchecked, will invite communism in. And it wasn't just Elvis. It's Chuck Berry, who now here is not just rock and roll, but here you have an African American who Anglo youth are loving. And you get this, very. So not only are they listening to Elvis now with the shaking hips and gyrations, but now they're cheering for and listening to a black man, listening to this race music or interracial mixings. And whites and blacks and Latinos are mixing on the dance floor in front of these musicians.
It's the color of the skin. It's also the wholesomeness of the lyrics. This is not the boogie woogie choo choo. Or look at the lyrics of Buddy Holly. Here's a song, Rock Me Baby. And when you hear the song, it doesn't sound that bad. But when you actually look at the lyrics, it's kind of very sexually suggestive. Look at it with me. It says, well, put your arms around me now and try your best to squeeze me. Love me, my baby, you know how. Yes, rock me, my baby. Well, rock me like a hickory dickory clock. Rock upon my baby up and down around the clock. Rock me, my baby. This is very sexually suggestive. Now, it's not Ludacris as My Fantasy. This is not explicit lyrics in the modern context. But you better believe to the parents who were trying to forge and create and maintain that culture of conformity, oh, this, you better believe, is explicit lyrics. So you have the explicit lyric. You have the white guy, Elvis, who is causing all the girls to go wild and wanting to throw their bras on stage at him. You have cheering for a black man singing Johnny Be Good with Chuck Berry. And then you also have another one who, unfortunately, along with Buddy Holly, will die at a very young age in a plane crash. And that, of course, is Richie Valens. Born Richard Valenzuela, he was a 17-year-old kid from the San Fernando Valley. He grew up hearing the Andres Seca version of the old Mexican folk song, which had been popularized during the golden age of Mexican cinema in the 1940s. He would have a hit song with La Bamba. But the song itself is interesting just in and of itself. It had roots. In fact, enslaved Africans that had been brought to Veracruz, Mexico, hundreds of years ago, had started a cultural fusion that had long been a means of survival of African, indigenous, and Spanish traditions. And what this created as this, mismatch of cultures were forced together in Mexico, it created a fusion of sound. And one of that mashups was a musical style that was called son jarocho. Now, the instruments and sound in son jarocho get played in a rhythm that is undeniably Afro-Caribbean. And it is this Afro-Caribbean connection that's been there for hundreds of years, mixed with a little bit of Espanol and indigenous populations. The Richie Valens version, however, of the song La Bamba added a modern twist of rock and roll. Remember, though, he's a 17-year-old kid growing up. Segregation is still legal in large parts of the United States. Jim and Juan Crow. Some kids are being punished in public schools just for speaking Spanish. Talked about that before. But there was at least one cultural force that seemed to be able to cross those boundaries. As one writer put it, Richie Valens took it to a whole new level and to a whole new audience, teenagers. They weren't hearing, when they heard the song La Bamba, they weren't hearing a Mexican folk song or Mexican folk music. They were hearing rock and roll. Of course, rock and roll itself is a mashup of musical styles, much like son jarocho, that had roots in enslavement and colonization. And the funny part was La Bamba, the song, released in 1958, was actually the B-side of his record, but it became a surprise hit, reaching number 22 on the singles charts. Now, unfortunately, as I mentioned a minute ago, he will tragically die in 1959 in a plane crash alongside Buddy Holly. But here is a popular Mexicano singing a very popular song in Spanish that whether you were Anglo, Black, Latinx, didn't matter.
they were all listening to it and dancing to a song that's completely in Spanish. I have to admit, growing up, like I loved the song growing up. I didn't realize how old it was when I was growing up. Like I didn't realize it was 1958, but I never even fully realized that it was all in Spanish. So I revisited it years later. And this is honestly what that parents' generation was afraid of. Because they were being, quote unquote, indoctrinated or infiltrated by this music and this cultural background and stylings. They weren't even realizing that was the idea. Now, was it really pervasive? Of course not. It was fun, it was exciting, it was something that the youth could rally around and push against the constraints that their parents set boundaries, right? So let's listen to La Bamba for a minute. Now, I really wanted to show you guys more of a video of this. Unfortunately, there are very few videos and of any good quality that are out there that are accessible of him actually playing the song. If you Google it on YouTube, go on there and just search for La Bamba. And what you will find video wise is actually a movie that was made called La Bamba. That's a pretty darn good movie about the life and kind of legacy of Richie Valens. I encourage you to go check it out and watch it. It is worth watching. And the actor who plays Richie Valens does a very good job. I want you to hear his voice though, versus seeing somebody else. But again, much like the 1920s with jazz, this is creating that racial mixing. It's a mixing of music styles, just like jazz was. It was a mixing of, language in this case. It was also things like, Johnny Be Good. If you listen to the lyrics of La Bamba, there's some lamentation in there about their position of being Black and Latino. There's that teenage angst involved, or that angst of dealing with the conformity society. And this is creating some massive cracks that the parents are freaked out about. Again, we could spend a lot longer just dissecting the music of Latino artists. We'll do so throughout the rest of the semester as well as we go forward. But in addition to music, it was also literature and movies. Popular books and movies, such as the movie Rebel Without a Cause, where a very popular actor, James Dean, plays a character named Jim Stark, who is a white, middle-class, suburban teenager that is forced to relocate with his family to Los Angeles. His parents fight constantly with one another, and it makes him feel as though they betrayed him. And because of this, he gets into fights and commits vandalism. And on the one hand, it should have been a kind of warning to young people, don't do this. But what parents saw when they saw James Dean's character was a handbook on how to rebel, or what happens if we don't have a strict conformity culture. So it becomes a way to push against those boundaries for young people. Literature, things like Catcher in the Rye in Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451. Again, Salinger's book was a controversial novel written for adults but embraced by adolescents because its message of teenage angst and alienation. By 1961, this was the most censored book in America for fear it corrupted youths. Likewise, Fahrenheit 451 was a response to government censorship and control of the American people, conformity culture, 1950s. These are all cracks: music, movies, literature. But the thing is, one of the things that produced these cracks was World War II. These things that already existed, right? We talked about the 1920s. There were always cracks in what the parents wanted. But World War II becomes this trigger point, this turning point, this linchpin that changes things even more, that would produce even larger cracks in the consensus. Because it wasn't just the entertainment value of things that were causing the youth to rebel against their parents. No. It was civil rights. It was standing up for citizenship. Like, we fought a freaking war to preserve democracy and freedom. But yet, back in the United States, are we really living up to those ideas of all men created equal? And so much like it did for African Americans, who increasingly had embraced that double V campaign I mentioned last time, victory abroad, victory at home. The conflict overseas exposed Latino troops to an international setting where men and women of different races and nationalities had come together and worked together for a common cause. And it created a new awareness of race and racism throughout the world. It caused, Latinos and other groups to become more receptive to a more liberal, open society. And they returned home from the war and they began questioning the status quo, the static racial order, the subordination of communities that were deeply affected by the continued discrimination. They saw a country that was unwilling to extend full democratic rights to Mexicanos. And what this did was it amplified the already entrenched civil rights movement, trying to deal with that gap between the doctrine of democracy that the U.S. advocated abroad and the racial prejudices that were maintained at home. In both the NAACP and LULAC would see a dramatic explosion in memberships during and after the war years. Now, the publication of To Secure These Rights, we talked about a little bit ad nauseum last time, exposed the rampant discrimination. And while World War II did bring heightened awareness of the common oppression of Blacks, Browns, and Asians, highlighting the discrimination in employment, in housing, in education, in politics, and military service, highlighting the entrenched segregation, if not by law, then by custom. And despite all this, though, despite the commonality faced by African Americans, Mexicanos, and Asians, no broader coalition ever fully materialized. There are times when it works, when African Americans and Mexican Americans will work together. But for the most part, it fails. And it shouldn't have. And this is both a failure on the part of African Americans and Mexican Americans. It's also a failure, though, because Anglos pushed to divide their races, knowing that if they ever joined together, they'd be pretty much unstoppable. And again, there are many reasons for this. One is, of course, that LULAC was still promoting whiteness, and that they had to push themselves and separate themselves against African Americans to preserve this. Taking case in point, 1943, the Caucasian Race Equal Privileges. So LULAC lawyers, Manuel Gonzalez and Alfonso Perales, these LULAC lawyers from San Antonio wanted to fight segregation. They introduced a bill in the Texas legislation that would prohibit discrimination against Caucasians. So Caucasian Race Equal Privileges, okay? It's a resolution that's presented to the Texas legislature by these two LULAC lawyers, saying they wanted to protect and prohibit discrimination. They wanted to protect against and prohibit discrimination against the Caucasian race, white people. So what they're doing here is they're reasserting their identity as members of the white race, so as they can have equal access to public facilities, as opposed to joining with African Americans. They are pitting themselves against African Americans here in an attempt to once again claim whiteness. And this Caucasian Race Equal Privileges Resolution will pass in 1943. But in this attempt to achieve equality and acceptance and equality for, Mexicanos, it pit them at odds against African Americans. And remember, this is all happening. This is 1943, right? This has happened the same time as other high-profile demonstrations of ethno-racial animosity, like the Japanese internment camps. Remember the forced internment of 120,000 people of Japanese descent, 2/3 of whom were U.S. citizens, considered enemies of the nation and forced to take these loyalty, questionnaires and denied citizenship and voting rights. Yeah, those relocation camps, they were supported heavily by Mexican Americans. For the same reason they supported things like the Caucasian Race Equal Privileges Resolution. It was a way, this is a Faustian pact. They were embracing the existing racism of the country toward others in an effort to improve their own situation or to deflect from the racial animosity against themselves. They did just, show their support and loyalty to the United States. And so during World War II, yes, it's an opportunity. Yes, people are more active in fighting against the discrimination. And you can argue for their group, it seemed like the best idea at the time. But it's a Faustian pact that's going to ultimately blow up in their faces, because they never established a broader coalition among all the minority groups, instead leaving each group to fend for themselves. And during World War II, LULAC, again, criticism is warranted here. LULAC, for all the good they had done in the late 20s and 30s, out of selfish self-interest, they were pitting themselves against other ethno-racial groups that were experiencing all the problems at that time, including African Americans, because they don't want to be seen as being black or darker. They want to be considered as white. They pit themselves against Japanese Americans, and Japanese because enemies of the state. So this we can count as a failure of this era, but there would not be a larger black-brown coalition. But despite this broader failure, there would be a number of advances in civil rights. And it starts really with what's called the Longoria Affair. Felix Longoria, he was a World War II soldier who was killed in action in the Pacific versus the Japanese. He's from Three Rivers in South Texas. In 1948, his body is returned home. And his wife asked the local funeral home to hold a wake. A funeral, right? A place of memorial. Reasonable request, seemed natural. He's an officer who was killed in action. Either way, he's a human being. And the local funeral director feared that it would upset the Anglo community, as it would disregard the white-only segregation laws. In other words, the whites wouldn't want it, was his response. Well, this event will cause a statewide and then a national outrage, thanks in large part to Hector Garcia. Hector Garcia was a medic during World War II. He was returned home as a decorated veteran himself. He was working as a doctor in South Texas, and he received a call about this Longoria incident and became heavily involved. And he would become a leader of a new civil rights organization known as the American GI Forum. This was formed by World War II veterans following the war in Corpus Christi, Texas. The purpose was to secure equal rights for Latino veterans. They protested versus racial discrimination in the Veterans Administration, the VA hospitals, as well as in educational centers. So their goal was to achieve equality, and they were specifically focused on World War II veterans. But Hector Garcia would also get future President Lyndon Baines Johnson involved in the Longoria issue. You see, in 1948, Lyndon Johnson, again, future president, was a senator from Texas. And he, unlike the majority of Southern senators, was very sensitive to the plight of Latinos. You see, he was born and raised in rural Texas. He actually was a teacher in one of those Mexican schools, and he understood well the struggles of Mexican Americans due to segregation. And he took the Longoria issue as a personal affront, because not only did he sympathize with Mexicans and Mexican Americans from being a teacher at a Mexican school, but he was a veteran himself. And he saw this as an attack both on Mexican Americans, but also on the U.S. Armed Forces and on American principles itself. And he used his political influence to move Longoria's body from Texas to be laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery in Washington, D.C. And this event and the resolution would bring national attention to the discrimination and bigotry that existed in Texas. It also revealed Lyndon Baines Johnson's concern for civil rights that would become a hallmark of his presidency. Now, following the Longoria affair, the American GI Forum would launch a campaign to expose the segregated practices of mortuaries and cemeteries in Texas. Yes, cemeteries were also segregated. You were segregated in life, discriminated against in life, and in death. The GI Forum also initiated anti-discrimination lawsuits and voter registration campaigns to increase Mexican American political clout, create, embrace, and enhance that voting bloc. The GI Forum chapters would expand throughout the nation, as membership would also expand to include non-veterans and women as well. And they would go on to lead the attack on educational segregation and would eventually do away with what was known as de jure segregation throughout the country. And it's this issue over segregation, especially in schools, that really begins to show larger cracks in the consensus culture. That's a topic for the next part of this lecture, the second half, and we'll discuss some of these very important court cases. But until then, take care and bye-bye.